She was an introverted girl, a quiet lover of books, never once believing her voice could reach anyone else. But then, by chance, she bought an unfinished manuscript at a flea market, and the seller turned out to be an anonymous millionaire, once a legendary writer. The book was about her, about things she had never told a soul, and now he wanted her to write the ending. They say quiet people live in worlds of their own. But if you happened upon the girl that Saturday afternoon, petite, walking slowly through the flea market, a faded canvas bag tucked under one arm, you might feel something different. She didn't just live inside her world, she lived inside everything left unsaid. That day's market wasn't anything special. Someone was selling old paintings, children rolled toy cars across the pavement, and the smell of slightly burnt hot dogs drifted from somewhere in the distance. People laughed, haggled, shuffled shoulder to shoulder through narrow aisles. Only, she moved quietly among them, not looking for anything in particular, not hoping to see anyone she knew. She didn't care for noise or chaos, but something about markets like this made her feel oddly at peace, like wandering into someone else's memory. Her fingers brushed against an old book. Hardcover, yellow-brown, fading into grey, a faint water stain at the bottom corner, like someone once held it while crying. No author's name on the cover, just 4 words, written in smudged black ink, "To the ones who stayed." She opened it. The first page was blank. On the second, a single shaky handwritten line. "If you're reading this, I've been waiting for you." She paused. Her eyes rested on the words like they were whispers from years ago. There was no real narrative, just fragments, journal entries, unsent letters, and solitary monologues, like the voice of someone who had lived alone for too long. "I once stood at a train station, unsure whether to leave or stay. There was a girl who always read by the window every Saturday afternoon. Not everyone who leaves is gone for good, but those who stay, those are the ones we remember." She looked up. Behind the wooden table stacked with worn books sat an older man. He was still as if he'd been there for hours, a cup of tea long gone cold beside him, eyes gazing somewhere far beyond. He wasn't looking at her. He seemed to be seeing through her, into something unnamed and buried within her. "That one's not for sale," he said, his voice light and dry like early winter wind. Then he paused, reconsidered, and gave a small nod. "But if you've picked it up, maybe it's already chosen you." She stood there, holding the book, unsure whether to put it back or keep it. He didn't name a price. He didn't smile or wait. He just looked at her, as if confirming something long decided. She opened her wallet and offered a few bills. He took them without counting. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. People didn't usually ask. "Lena," she said. He nodded. "Keep it close, Lena." She turned and walked away, the book pressed tightly to her chest. But inside her, something stirred. A strange rhythm, not quite fear, not quite hope. Back at her small apartment, she didn't open the book right away. She set it on the table and made tea. Something herbal and soft, like the tone of his voice. When the afternoon sun spilled across the floor in long slanted stripes, she opened it again. "Maybe you don't need to be found. Maybe you just need to be seen." Her heart tightened. The words weren't loud. They didn't declare. But to her, someone who had always felt invisible in the world, they were the first that ever truly saw her. She turned the page, and then she stopped cold. She always sat at table 3 by the left window. She never ordered anything, but mint tea. She read Murakami or sometimes poetry, and she always left before anyone could start a conversation. Lena closed her eyes. For a moment, nothing moved. She knew who that was. She knew the writer had once been close enough to see but never to touch. She stood, opened her window. The evening air was cool against her skin. She held the book to her chest, took a step back, and sank down onto the wooden floor. Light fell across her hair, painting it the color of wild honey. On the last page, a single line waited. "If you're still here, maybe you were meant to finish what I couldn't." Lena picked up a pen. It had been so long since she'd written by hand. She turned to the next page and began, "I've always stayed, I just never said it out loud." In a world crowded with noise, an unnamed book, a silent girl, and a solemn bookseller had created something that touched a heart, and the story had begun with something never spoken. She returned to the familiar room, the small wooden desk, the window cracked just enough to let in the air, the teacup resting to her left like a silent ritual. But this time, Lena wasn't just a reader. She was holding something that belonged to someone else. A fragment of a soul who had once written, once waited, once seen her from afar. She read each page with ceremonial quiet, as though a single sound might shatter the space between the lines. But what haunted her wasn't the content, it was the look in the old man's eyes. It hadn't been curious nor indifferent. It was like a mirror, not one that reflected her face, but one that showed the things she had never said out loud. When he looked at her, Lena felt as if she were reading a book about herself, flipping to a chapter she'd never dared to open. Sunday morning. She wasn't sure why she returned to the market. Same path, the narrow turn between two souvenir shops. And then, still him, sitting like a living statue behind his scatter of books. She didn't walk straight to him. She moved slowly, afraid he might not be there. But he was, and this time when she approached, he looked up. "Did you read it?" he asked, not needing to say what it was. She nodded. Some of it. And she didn't know what to say. Her lips moved, then stopped. Finally, she whispered, "Strange, but familiar." He smiled, barely more than a twitch at the corner of his mouth. "I wrote when I had no one left to talk to." Lena sat down on the small stool beside his table. It was the first time she'd ever stayed in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by glances, movement, life. But with him it felt separate, like the world had stepped a little to the side. "It was just a draft," he said. "I wrote it, then left it. I didn't think anyone would care." She glanced at the books on the table. Many had no titles. Some were so old the pages looked brittle as ash. "They're yours?" He shook his head. "They belong to others. Then they became mine. Like loneliness. Nobody wants to keep it. But everyone's had it." She said, "Nothing." The words lingered in the air, settling gently inside her. A boy ran past, dropping his ice cream. His mother knelt to clean it, the child sobbing in protest. Lena watched the scene as if from behind a pane of glass, everything vivid, but she remained the observer. The old man watched too, then turned to her. "What's your name?" "Lena," she said again. But this time her voice didn't falter. It was clear, as if her name had finally found weight. "Lena," he repeated slowly. "A beautiful name. Soft, but sad. And you?" He held her gaze a moment longer than usual. "I used to be someone," he said. "Now I prefer to let people wonder." Half a joke, half a truth. But Lena heard the weariness in his tone, the way part of him had left with the name he no longer carried. She looked around, then reached for another book, a small spiral notebook, its edges worn thin. "Do you like to write?" he asked. Suddenly she startled slightly, then nodded. "When I was little, but then I stopped." "Why?" She didn't answer right away. Then, barely louder than breath, she said, "Because I thought I had nothing important to say." He was quiet. The wind rustled the open books, fluttering a few pages. Then he reached behind him and pulled out another notebook, similar to the draft she held, but with more annotations, folded corners, and red markings across the margins. "Would you like to read the full version?" She blinked. "I thought you didn't share it with anyone." "You're the first who stayed long enough to see it. I think maybe it's time." Lena wasn't sure what she was doing, but her hand reached out. She took the notebook. In that moment, the air seemed to still, not because of anything grand, but because of something small and honest. A trust passed quietly between them, a connection born from silence. She looked at him one last time. His eyes hadn't changed. They didn't try to understand her. But they didn't look away either. It was the kind of gaze that had been waiting there forever, just to say, "I see you." Lena walked away. This time she didn't look back, but she knew, deep in her chest, that she would return, not for the book, not because of any promise, but because of the final lingering feeling she was no longer the only one reading what had never been written. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She placed the notebook beside her pillow, afraid that if she left it too far from reach, something within it might disappear. From her window, the city lay hushed, rows of old brick buildings glowing softly. Under the amber streetlight, she could hear her own breathing clearly and the quiet, certain pull of something in those pages waiting, watching the part of her she'd never dared to face. She sat up, switched on the desk lamp, and opened. The notebook, it wasn't a story, as it wasn't a novel. It was a stream of thoughts scribbled across sleepless nights, sometimes disjointed, sometimes so raw they made her stop reading just to breathe. I used to write to be known. Now I write so I don't disappear. She paused there, eyes stinging. The next line came in a different hand, shaky, urgent, as if written mid-tremor. I first saw her in a small bookstore on Walnut Street. She stood between the shelves of philosophy and literature, not reaching for a single book. But the way she looked at the spines, like each name held the exhale of someone who once tried to live. Lena closed the notebook. Her heart thudded. Walnut Street. She'd lived near there 3 years ago during university. Every Saturday she wandered into that dusty old bookshop. She never spoke to anyone, never bought much, but something always drew her back, like a thread she couldn't untangle. She remembered once seeing a man by the window reading a newspaper. She hadn't seen his face, not his age, just the way he looked up and looked at her. That gaze, it had been his, the bookseller's. She flipped through the notebook again, faster this time. The ink was smudged, but the sentence stood out. I never knew her name. But she felt like a memory I couldn't quite recall, only that I'd once belonged to it. Lena rose, walked to the mirror. She stared into her own eyes, feeling the line blur between the observer and the observed. She, who had always folded into herself, had once been a character in someone else's story. She turned to the notebook's first page, this time noticing a small symbol in the bottom corner. 3 dots stacked, a mark she remembered from a few vintage literary books. She ran to the living room and dug through an old box of paperbacks. One of them was a worn collection of short stories she'd bought years ago on Walnut Street. The Quiet Rain Will Come. She opened the title page. Author, H.D. Rowe. She looked back at the notebook. Same symbol, same cadence, the same quiet, aching prose that stirred something long buried. D. Rowe. A name once whispered in literary circles as myth. Her voice that had vanished without scandal, without farewell. And now the man selling forgotten books at the corner of a flea market was writing again, writing an unfinished manuscript, writing about her. The world around her fell into stillness. Time, memory, silence, all folding in. That gaze, it was his. Those sentences, they had once belonged to her. Lena sank to the floor, holding the notebook like a relic of a life she hadn't known she'd been living. A fragment of someone else's memory, now calling her name so clearly, it made her chest tremble. The next morning, Lena returned to the market. The wooden table was there, but empty. No books, no man, only a folded slip of paper tucked beneath a cold teacup. She pulled it out. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sometimes, to be found, you have to let someone see your loneliness first. No name, heck, no clues. She looked around. No one knew where he'd gone. It was as if he'd never been there, except to her. But in her hands was proof. The pages, the words, and the name. H.D. Rowe. And one thing Lena now knew for certain. This wasn't the ending. Perhaps it was the beginning of the next chapter. One in which she was no longer just the reader, but the one living the lines. There was something different about the flea market that afternoon. Not the light, not the wind, but the presence of him. He was there, seated behind the same wooden table, a cup of tea by his side as always. But this time, his gaze met hers. The moment she stepped in, no surprise, no call. But unmistakably he had been waiting. Lena slowed her steps. In her hand, she clutched the notebook she had nearly finished reading the night before. She didn't know what she would say or ask. She only knew that part of her was being drawn toward him, not by words, but by unfinished sentences, by the quiet between the lines. He didn't speak, just gestured to the empty chair beside him. Lena sat down. Silence settled between them. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You read it?" She nodded. "And what did you think?" Lena looked down at her hands, twisting a pen slowly between her fingers. Then she exhaled. It felt real, empty, and very alone. He nodded, as if she had named something he'd never quite been able to say himself. "I never thought anyone would understand those parts," he said, his tone as soft as falling leaves. "But you seem like someone who's lived." There's more. She didn't know how to answer. She just looked at him more closely this time. The creases around his eyes resembled letters unsent. His posture leaned forward slightly, like someone always ready to listen but afraid of being turned away. Then he stood. From beneath the table, he retrieved an old leather bag. Setting it between them, he unlatched the clasp and pulled out a thick stack of pages, handwritten, some stapled together, many crossed through with red ink. "This is the manuscript I never finished," he said. "I used to think I'd complete it when I got old, but now that I'm not sure I know how to end anything anymore." He slid it across to her. Lena placed her hand on it. The pages were warm, not from the sun, but from the weight of their meaning. "Why give it to me, Memoir?" she asked. He looked at her then, and the look was no longer that of a quiet observer. It was a gaze searching for something, understanding, maybe recognition, because I think you understand the parts that were never written. She opened the first page. It wasn't a title, but a single line penciled in faintly. "I don't write so people will know who I am. I write so I can remember I've lived." Lena looked up. She didn't know whether to say yes or Tayosti, but something unmistakable stirred inside her. She was no longer just a reader. This manuscript, messy, annotated, filled with erasures and silences, was asking her not just to read, but to enter, to respond and to co-create. In a way, he wasn't just inviting her into a world of words. He was inviting her into the most hidden part of himself, the place where he had buried longing, failure, and everything unfinished. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. "Just read," he said. "And if anything wants changing, change it." There was such clarity in that request, it made her more breathless than if he'd said something complicated. Because in its simplicity was something heavier, trust. And trust from a stranger is the heaviest gift of all. She held the manuscript close and stood. "My house is at the bottom of Rowan Hill," he said softly. "Green door. If you ever feel like stopping by. No urgency, no condition. Just an opening." As Lena left the market, the sky deepened to dusk, but something inside her had begun to glow, not because she carried a manuscript, but because for the first time, she wasn't just seen, she was trusted. The manuscript had no cover, just a stack of pages thick with ink, dog-eared, stained with old coffee, like they had kept him company through long, quiet afternoons where words were the only voice he had. Lena spread the pages across her table. A steaming cup of tea sat beside them. The silence around her was so complete, she could hear the second hand ticking on the wall clock. She took a deep breath. Then began. "People often think loneliness is the absence of someone, but I believe it's the sharp presence of oneself, so present that no one else can reach in." She paused, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too well. The words named a kind of solitude she had never dared to. The ache wasn't from being alone in the world, but from carrying something inside that made staying or leaving equally unbearable. She read on. "I once loved someone just for the way she bowed her head to read. Not for her face, not for her voice, but because her silence resembled mine. And when two silences see each other, they become a kind of music only the lost can hear." Her heart clenched. It wasn't just a man recalling love, it was a reflection of her own unspoken history, the quiet ache of loving someone who would never know she existed. The way she had watched from afar, held her feelings close and poured them into unsent lines in a private notebook. She flipped to a page marked with a note. Not sure about keeping this part. Below it, a letter. If you're reading this, it means I never had the courage to give it to you while you were still around. I didn't want you to see me weak, but I've missed you in ways no one should miss someone who never belonged to them. Lena froze. She read it again. And again. Each word sank into her like something she had written herself, then forgotten. Or maybe something she had once longed to receive. She closed her eyes. In her mind, a small cafe on the corner, soft light on the pavement, a notebook in her lap, a pen in hand. Saturday evenings spent writing to people who'd never read. Her words, writing to understand herself, to hold on to feelings before they faded, and now this man, a stranger, a once legend, was bringing it all back, not by naming it, but by writing deeply enough to stir what she thought had been buried for good. By 2 a.m., she was still reading. Each page felt like a mirror. Each paragraph, a gentle cut, not painful, but precise enough to let old blood rise, and with it a strange kind of healing. Another line. There are people we'll never touch, but they live. In the things we write, in the unfinished dreams, in the far-off gaze that returns when we remember. Lena pressed her lips together. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't fall. It wasn't grief. It was recognition. The morning light poured into her apartment, falling across the manuscript now spread wide across the table. Lena picked up a pencil and wrote in the margin beside the letter he had once tried to cross out. Keep it. Maybe she would have wanted to write something like that too. That day she took the manuscript and walked to the end of Rowan Street. A green door, just like he'd said. She knocked gently. No answer. But tucked beneath a small, potted plant was a note folded once. I'll be at the old bookshop, the place where everything began. If you come, I'll tell you the part I never wrote. Lena smiled. There was no need to rush. The manuscript wasn't finished. But the most important thing had begun. She was no longer just a reader. She was part of the story now. At first, she only meant to underline a few lines. A wordy sentence here, a repeated phrase there. Not because she thought she was better, but because some things, after reading them again and again, stirred a quiet instinct in her. If it were me, I'd say it differently. Softer. Clearer. More honest. She wrote small notes in the margins. This could be trimmed, emotions still intact without the explanation. Keep this. The silence here is powerful. But then, she rewrote an entire passage. A memory of the father in the manuscript reminded her of the first time she saw her own father cry. Not from grief, but from helplessness. She had been too young to understand it then. But now, she typed, I used to think my father didn't know how to hurt, until one day I saw him standing in the doorway, hands clenched and trembling. No one asked anything, but I knew he didn't need a question, he just needed someone to see him. Lena read the paragraph aloud, slowly. This wasn't editing anymore. This was writing, for the first time, not to hide, but to be seen. The next day she went to the old bookshop on Rowan Street, just as he'd said. The door was unlocked. A soft chime sounded as she stepped in. No customers, just him, sitting at the counter reading the pages she had brought. He looked up, not surprised, but his eyes were deeper than usual. You edit well, he said. Lena lowered her gaze. I just thought, if it were me, that's how I'd feel it. He nodded. That's why I wanted you to read it. Not to judge, but to feel it. He placed his hand on the manuscript. Now I want you to write. Not revise, write. She looked at him, frozen. Write the part that's missing, he said. The part I didn't have the courage to reach, and I think, if anyone could fill in the silence, it's you. Lena didn't answer. Not then. She left. But that night she didn't sleep. In front of her, a blank page. Not pressure, but fear. Fear she wouldn't be good enough. Fear of finding emptiness inside herself. Fear of touching a nameless sorrow. Then she remembered a line from his manuscript. "A writer doesn't need to be perfect. A writer just needs to be honest." She picked up the pen, wrote a paragraph. Then another. No more editing and no more hesitation. The next day she brought it to him. "This is what I understood," she said. He read slowly, each line making him pause longer than a breath. At last he closed it gently. "You just wrote what I never dared to." It wasn't praise, but to her it felt like truth. From then on they worked together. No contracts, no titles, just afternoons in the quiet bookshop, where she wrote, he revised, and both of them debated, laughed softly, and sat in more silence than words. But this silence was no longer the old kind. It wasn't lonely, it was full of presence, of respect, of something growing quietly inside her, like a tree rising through the cracks in stone. One afternoon, while revising the ending, he turned to her. "Do you think of yourself as a writer?" Lena didn't answer at once. Then she smiled. "I don't think it matters, as long as I still want to write." He nodded. "That's enough." And that day they decided to send it off. 2 names signed at the bottom of the title page. H.D. Roe and Lena Cross. She once believed she would always be the reader, never the author. But now she knew, sometimes writing doesn't begin with inspiration. It begins when someone believes your voice is worth hearing. That morning, Lena woke earlier than usual. On her desk sat the final draft, pages now neat and numbered, margins carefully marked, bound with a thin length of twine tied loosely at the corner. She stared at the names beneath the title, H.D. Roe and Lena Crossnot, with disbelief. But with a quiet, persistent hesitation, as if, once her name was printed, something would shift in a way that couldn't be undone. She had never dreamed of being listed as a co-author. She thought of herself as part of the healing, not the story. A hand behind the curtain. A voice that helped him finish, not one that shared the cover. But he had said, "You deserve to have your name on the spine." At the old bookshop he was already waiting. On the table lay a large envelope, the publisher's address written out in his familiar hand. He didn't say much, just pointed to the pen. And the envelope. She took the pen, her fingers trembling slightly. "We're really sending it?" she asked. "If we don't," he said, "we'll never know who it might reach." He glanced at the manuscript. "Writing is a solitary act, but publishing, that's an act of trust." She smiled faintly. "You're surprisingly optimistic." He shook his head. "No, just old." They walked to the post office together. The stone-paved street clicked beneath their shoes. October air wrapped gently around them. The trees along the sidewalk had begun to shed their leaves, flashes of gold and rust spinning down like slow confetti. Lena said nothing. But every step felt like letting go of something she'd been holding close to her chest. At the counter, the clerk asked for the sender's name. "Noyu," he said, then turned to her. "And?" "Chemas Cross," she answered after a heartbeat that skipped sideways. The clerk weighed the package, stamped it, slid it onto the conveyor. That was it. No applause, no ceremony. But inside Lena, something had closed. And something else had begun to open. Back at the shop, he didn't return to his chair. Just stood at the window, watching the soft drizzle begin to fall. "Are you scared?" he asked. Lena nodded. "Of what?" "That no one will need what we've written." He smiled. "Do you think, the day you picked up that book at the flea market, anyone imagined it would change both our lives?" She didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, she said, "I used to think writing was a way to hold on to what I couldn't say. But now, I think it's also a way to let go." That afternoon, Lena returned alone to the flea market. The wooden table was gone, but she sat again on the familiar stone step. In her hands, a printed copy, not to revise but to remember. She flipped to a page at random. It was one she had written. Beside it, in his handwriting, was a note. This is the part I could never write because I never had the courage to hope. Lena closed the manuscript, rested her hand on the cover. Eyes shut. It didn't matter what the publisher would say. It didn't matter who would read it or who would understand, because in this moment, this quiet, rain-dappled moment, she knew she had stepped out of silence. And that alone was a quiet, extraordinary triumph. The email arrived on a quiet winter morning. Lena was sitting with a cup of tea wrapped in a loose sweater, snow falling outside her window like soft ashes. Her phone buzzed, a small notification blinking on the screen. Subject: manuscript. Response: she didn't open it right away. Her heart beat faster, not from hope but from fear. She had learned to let go, had reminded herself that writing was never about recognition, but still, somewhere deep down, a part of her had hoped that what they had written might have reached someone. When she finally opened the email, her eyes moved slowly over the lines. "We are deeply moved by the intimacy and quiet power of your manuscript. We would be honored to publish it under both names." She drew in a long breath. That was all. No confetti, no celebration, but inside her something delicate bloomed, an emotion too subtle to name, one she could only feel by being completely still. Months later, the book was printed. A small bookshop in the suburbs hosted a modest release. Lena stepped inside, into a quiet space bathed in soft yellow light. There was no stage, no reporters, just a long wooden table at the center of the room, stacked with fresh copies. She walked toward it. The title remained just as it had been, from the very first draft to the ones who stayed, and beneath it 2 names, Hilda, Roe and Lena Cross. She didn't touch the book right away. She simply stood there staring at the cover like it was a mirror, reflecting not just her face, but the long, quiet journey that had brought her here. A bookstore staff member approached and asked gently, "Are you Lena?" She nodded, barely above a breath. "There's a note someone left for you." She unfolded the small slip of paper, quartered neatly. It was his handwriting. Not every name needs to be remembered, but if someone was ever seen through what we wrote, then writing was enough. She left the shop in the late afternoon, the book in her hands. Outside, the sun was soft, the wind threading through rows of bare trees. Lena paused beside a brick wall with a small crack running through it, a place she had passed 100 times, never once stopping. But today, she did. She looked at the fracture and smiled. It was like the one inside her, no longer something to hide. Because it was through that very crack the light had entered. She went home, placed the book on her shelf. Not the highest one, not the most prominent, just somewhere easy to see, like herself now. Not loud, but no longer hidden. In the eye. Quiet of the room, she poured another cup of tea and opened to the first page. There, printed in italics, a line that hadn't been in the original draft, likely added by him. For those who once believed they were only a side character in someone else's story. Lena closed the book. No more words were needed, no explanations, because, at last, she had found what she'd been searching for all her life, a place to belong between the lines, within the silence, and in the heart of some unknown reader. Somewhere. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. And if you've ever felt like an extra in someone else's life, remember, sometimes your silence is just the first page of something beautiful yet to be written.